The breaking point, 1861-1862. Standing here today, it is almost impossible to imagine what America looked like in 1861. We were a nation barely holding itself together, torn apart by a question that had haunted us since our founding. Could a country built on the promise of freedom continue to exist half slave and half free? The answer, as it turned out, was no. I'm here to take you through one of the most devastating periods in American history, and I promise you, what you're about to discover will change how you see this nation forever. If you find this journey through history compelling, please hit that subscribe button. Give this video a thumbs up, and let me know in the comments which aspect of the Civil War fascinates you most. Your support keeps this channel alive. Let me paint you a picture. It's April 12, 1861, just before dawn in Charleston, South Carolina. Confederate forces, under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard, have surrounded Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Inside, Major Robert Anderson and fewer than 90 Union soldiers await their fate. At 4:30 a.m., the first shell arcs through the darkness. The Civil War has begun, not with a whisper, but with a roar that would echo for 4 blood-soaked years. But how did we get here? The seeds of this conflict were planted decades earlier. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision. Each attempt to paper over the fundamental contradiction at America's heart only delayed the inevitable reckoning. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in November 1860 without carrying a single southern state, 7 states seceded before he even took office. By the time Fort Sumter fell, 11 states had left the Union to form the Confederate States of America. Now, here's what most people don't understand about the early days of the war. Both sides thought it would be over quickly. Young men rushed to enlist, terrified the fighting would end before they could prove their courage. In the North, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers for just 90 days of service. In the South, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was equally confident. Both were catastrophically wrong. The First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 shattered these illusions. Spectators from Washington actually came out with picnic baskets to watch the battle, expecting an easy Union victory. Instead, they witnessed a chaotic Confederate triumph that sent federal troops fleeing back to the capital in panic. The war, everyone suddenly realized, would not be a summer adventure. It would be a nightmare. General George B. McClellan took command of Union forces, spending months drilling and organizing what he called the finest army on the planet. But McClellan had a fatal flaw. He was brilliant at preparing for battle but terrified of actually fighting one. Lincoln grew increasingly frustrated, once remarking that if McClellan wasn't going to use the army, he'd like to borrow it. Meanwhile, in the Western Theater, a relatively unknown general named Ulysses S. Grant was making a name for himself. In February 1862, Grant captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee, forcing the Confederate commander to accept unconditional and immediate surrender. When news reached Washington, Lincoln finally had a general who wasn't afraid to fight. "I can't spare this man," Lincoln said. "He fights." The spring of 1862 brought the Peninsula Campaign, McClellan's elaborate attempt to capture Richmond by advancing up the Virginia Peninsula. It should have worked. McClellan had overwhelming numerical superiority, better equipment, and control of the waterways. But Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, and later Robert E. Lee, outmaneuvered him at every turn. The 7 days battles pushed McClellan back from the gates of Richmond, and the campaign collapsed. Then came Shiloh in April 1862, a battle so savage that veterans of Bull Run couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Over 2 days of fighting in Tennessee, nearly 24,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Grant himself walked among the wounded sheltering under the bluffs during a terrible rainstorm, unable to bear the sight and sound of their suffering. "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" said his subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman. "Yes," Grant replied. "Lick 'em tomorrow," though. By the summer of 1862, the romantic notions of war had died, along with tens of thousands of young men. This wasn't going to be a limited conflict. This was going to be a total war, and nobody knew when or how it would end. Want to see how this story continues? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2, where we'll explore the turning point of the entire war. Welcome back to our journey through America's bloodiest conflict. If you're just joining us, make sure to watch part 1 first, and please subscribe, like, and share this video to help others discover this important history. Now, let's continue where we left off. September 17, 1862, Shopsburg, Maryland. Along the banks of Antietam Creek, the single bloodiest day in American military history was unfolding. By the time the sun set, over 22,000 men had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. To put that in perspective, that's more American casualties in one day than the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War combined. But Antietam wasn't just about the staggering body count, it was about what came after. Robert E. Lee had invaded the North, hoping that a Confederate victory on Union soil might convince Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy, or at least force Lincoln to negotiate peace. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but Lee retreated back to Virginia, and that was enough. Lincoln finally had the victory he needed to do something he'd been planning for months. 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It stated that on January 1, 1863, all slaves in states still in rebellion would be declared forever free. Now, let's be clear about what this was and wasn't. It didn't free slaves in the border states loyal to the Union. It didn't even technically free slaves in areas already under Union control. But here's what it did do. It transformed the war from a conflict about preserving the Union into a crusade against slavery itself. The Confederacy could never recover from this strategic masterstroke. Britain and France, both of which had abolished slavery, could no longer support the South without appearing to endorse human bondage. Meanwhile, nearly 200,000 black men would eventually serve in Union uniform, fighting for their own freedom and their country's survival. As Frederick Douglass proclaimed, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter, US. Let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." The winter of 1862–63 was brutal for the Union. At Fredericksburg in December, General Ambrose Burnside ordered suicidal frontal assaults against entrenched Confederate positions on Marye's Heights. Wave after wave of Federal soldiers charged uphill into a meat grinder. One Confederate defender said it wasn't war, it was murder. Union casualties exceeded 12,000, with virtually nothing to show for it. Lincoln's desperation was palpable. He'd gone through multiple commanders of the Army of the Potomac: McDowell, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker. None could deliver victory. Meanwhile, in the Western Theater, Grant was methodically tightening his grip on Vicksburg, Mississippi, the Gibraltar of the Confederacy that controlled traffic on the Mississippi River. Then came Chancellorsville in May 1863. Fighting Joe Hooker commanded, a Union force more than twice the size of Lee's army. But Lee executed what many consider his masterpiece. Dividing his already smaller force, Lee sent Stonewall Jackson on a daring flanking march that shattered the Union right flank. It was a brilliant, stunning victory, but it came at a terrible cost. Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men during a reconnaissance mission. He died 8 days later, and Lee mourned that he had lost his right arm. Emboldened by Chancellorsville, Lee decided to invade the North again. His army marched through Maryland into Pennsylvania, foraging for supplies and threatening northern cities. The Union and Confederate armies converged on a small town called Gettysburg, where the greatest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere would decide the war's outcome. For 3 days in early July 1863, over 150,000 men fought across the fields and hills around Gettysburg. The first day went to the Confederates, pushing Union forces back through the town to Cemetery Hill. The second day brought desperate fighting at places like Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, Devil's Den, and the Peach Orchard, names that would be forever seared into the nation's memory. But it was the third day that became legendary. Lee, against the advice of his subordinate, James Longstreet, ordered a massive assault against the Union Center on Cemetery Ridge. Nearly 13,000 Confederate soldiers stepped off from Seminary Ridge and marched across 3/4 of a mile of open ground into concentrated artillery and rifle fire. Pickett's charge, as it became known, was magnificent and terrible. It was also suicidal. The charge was repulsed with devastating losses. As the survivors staggered back, Lee rode among them, saying, "It's all my fault." The Army of Northern Virginia had reached its high water mark and would never threaten the North again. The next day, July 4, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered to Grant after a 6-week siege. The Confederacy had been cut in two, and the Mississippi River, as Lincoln said, flowed unvexed to the sea. The war entered its final, brutal phase. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to see Part 3, where we'll witness the total war that brought the Confederacy to its knees. And please, leave a comment telling me what surprised you most about these battles. Welcome to the final part of our Civil War documentary. If you've been with us through parts 1 and 2, you know this has been an incredible journey. If you haven't watched them yet, go back and start from the beginning. And please, show your support by subscribing, liking, and commenting below. Let's finish this story together. After Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Confederacy's fate was sealed, but the fighting was far from over. In fact, the war's final 2 years would be its most brutal. This was when the conflict transformed into what we now call total war, where not just armies, but entire societies and economies became targets. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Ulysses S. Grant to Lieutenant General, a rank not held since George Washington, and gave him command of all Union armies. Grant had a simple strategy: apply constant, overwhelming pressure everywhere simultaneously. The Confederacy couldn't be everywhere at once, and their resources were dwindling. Grant told his generals, "Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also." That spring, Grant launched the Overland Campaign, a series of brutal battles through Virginia, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor. These weren't like earlier battles where armies would fight, then retreat to rest and regroup. Grant kept pushing, kept attacking, accepting horrific casualties because he understood something his predecessors hadn't. The Union could replace its losses. The Confederacy couldn't. At Cold Harbor, Grant ordered a frontal assault that resulted in 7,000 Union casualties in less than an hour, most in the first 8 minutes. He later wrote in his memoirs that he regretted that attack more than any other order he gave during the war. But he didn't stop. He moved south, crossed the James River, and laid siege to Petersburg, the key to Richmond. Meanwhile, in the West, William Tecumseh Sherman began his Atlanta campaign. Sherman was Grant's closest friend and shared his philosophy of total war. "War is cruelty," Sherman wrote, "and you cannot refine it." His army of 100,000 men advanced on Atlanta through the Georgia mountains, fighting a series of engagements against Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, who conducted a masterful fighting retreat. Jefferson Davis, frustrated by Johnston's constant retreating, replaced him with John Bell Hood, an aggressive commander who'd lost the use of an arm at Gettysburg and a leg at Chickamauga, who'd attacked Sherman repeatedly, and each time he attacked, his army was decimated. On September 2, 1864, Atlanta fell. Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, "Atlanta is ours," and fairly won. This victory may have saved Lincoln's presidency. He was running for re-election against his former general, George McClellan, who was running on a peace platform. The fall of Atlanta proved the war could be won, and in November, Lincoln won decisively. The message to the Confederacy was clear. There would be no negotiated peace, only total victory or total defeat. In November, Sherman did something unprecedented in American warfare. He cut his army loose from its supply lines and began his march to the sea, advancing 300 miles from Atlanta to Savannah with 60,000 men living off the land. His soldiers destroyed railroads, burned mills and cotton gins, freed slaves, and demolished the South's economic infrastructure. Sherman understood that to end the war, he had to break the Southern people's will to fight. His march left a 60-mile-wide path of destruction across Georgia. When Savannah fell in December, Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." He then turned north into the Carolinas, his march even more destructive. South Carolina, where secession began, suffered especially. The whole army is burning with an insatiable desire to wreak vengeance upon South Carolina. One Union officer wrote, "By spring 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Sherman was advancing through the Carolinas. Grant had Lee pinned at Petersburg. The Confederate government was bankrupt, its currency worthless. Desertions plagued Southern armies. The South was starving." On April 2nd, Grant finally broke through at Petersburg. Richmond fell the next day, its government officials fleeing south as fires consumed the city. Lee's army of Northern Virginia attempted to escape, but Union cavalry and infantry blocked every route. At Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Lee faced the inevitable. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee, in his finest dress uniform, met Ulysses S. Grant, in a mud-splattered field uniform, at the home of Wilmer McLean. In one of history's beautiful ironies, McLean had moved to Appomattox from Manassas to escape the war, only to have it literally end in his living room. The surrender terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would be paroled, allowed to go home, and officers could keep their sidearms. When Lee mentioned that many of his cavalrymen owned their own horses, Grant immediately said they could keep them. "They will need them for the spring plowing," he explained. As Lee rode away from the McLean house, Grant's soldiers began to celebrate. Grant ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." But the story doesn't end with military victory. 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. The president who had guided the nation through its darkest hour wouldn't live to oversee the peace. His vision of malice toward none, charity for all, died with him. Replaced by the bitterness and vindictiveness of Reconstruction, the Civil War killed approximately 750,000 Americans, more than all other American wars combined until Vietnam. It ended slavery but couldn't end racism. It preserved the Union but left scars that persist to this day. It proved that democracy could survive its greatest test, but at a cost almost too terrible to comprehend. Standing here today, looking back across those 4 years, I'm struck by the incredible courage and terrible tragedy. Young men, North and South, fought for what they believed was right, often dying in ways we can barely imagine. The war settled forever that the United States was one nation, indivisible, and that slavery had no place in that nation. But it also showed us how fragile democracy is, how easily we can turn on each other, and how much vigilance freedom requires. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the American Civil War. If you found this documentary valuable, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with anyone who loves history. In the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What lessons from the Civil War are still relevant today? Until next time, remember, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.